in the den of iniquity. Vicinity no pretty, calamity fi hit we any moment, what a pity. Tomorrow never certain, what dwells behind the curtain? The face of evil smirking, with that shifty eyes averting. It's not a steady bubble, could either pop or topple. Many will fall and stumble, let the dozers gather rubble. From LA to Colorado, Guinea to Burkina Faso, cannons could breach the towers and the troops will storm the castle. I say, run, run, come, make we get it. Because the peace that is bestowed upon the meek is overrated. So run, run, come, make we get it. Calling all your daughters and your sons, we come forget it. I say, run, run, come, make we get it. Because the peace that is bestowed upon the meek is overrated. Lord, run, run, come, make we get it. Calling all your daughters and your sons, we come forget it. With the rubble steady rising, and hearts are compromising. Convictions here are stifling, making evil appetizing. The fists are steady forming, and countenance is falling. Defenses are withdrawing, possibilities are falling. In these your circumstances, evil will make advances. Pick up your sword and lances, and be sure to take your stances. Victory is never promised, the battle is upon us. Gather the brave and honest, and the righteous in your corners.
And how would you say that, where would you say we are? And how would you say we have gotten to this point? Just in broad strokes, maybe just a rough strokes history. Yeah.
Well, what happened is that the events of the 60s and 70s, the various movements that took place, civil rights, women's movement, anti-war movement, and so forth. Of course, they were major tumultuous events for the entire country, read whites, etc. But for Black people, it was particularly poignant because, unlike the rest of the country, Black Americans had been oppressed, had been held back, had been stymied, stultified by way of, Jim Crow, which was a continuation essentially of slavery of a sort, with the end of slavery in 1865 and, the fits and starts through the Reconstruction period going up until turn of the 20th century. So much of the 20th century saw Black folks kind of still chafing under Jim Crow, and then, the late 60s or mid 60s into the 70s come along, and suddenly Black folk are free. And it raised a number of very interesting challenges. And one of those challenges were, are Black men and Black women still on the same page after they're set free? A lot of issues between Black men and Black women kind of took a back seat to racism, and once that was, pretty much off the table, then, real questions emerged as to whether or not, Black men and Black women wanted to kind of still stay on the same page. It's interesting to note, back in the starting in the 60s, but really accelerating in the 70s, to what we have today, how quickly the Black family fell apart. It was held together all through, the late 19th going into the 20th century, through all of the Jim Crow and so forth. But after all of that pretty much was dismantled, the Black family kind of fell apart pretty quickly. And my theory is, and this is something a lot of Black folks are going to be loath to admit, racism kind of kept us together, in a way that we may not be really wanting to admit. My argument in the book early on is that what we see today is a manifestation of freedom, which Black men and Black women have never really had before until about a half a century ago. And that we discovered that we want different things. Black women we have different ideas of what a good life looks like, of what freedom looks like, and how that plays itself out in real time. Black women have their own idea of it. Black men have theirs. And that kind of set the stage for what we have today.
Very well put indeed. So the idea that freedom will be a problem is something that I should say is a political reality. In other words, freedom is a problem, right? Freedom needs to be weighed against such things as, let's say, equality and also nature. Freedom needs to be weighed against such things as rights, such things as responsibilities, right? So in the world of politics and the whole political economy question, the idea of freedom is not just a good, it is something with which one has to contend, one has to deal with. Now that you have your freedom, what do you do with it? So there's that problem, which everybody has. But then there's the other problem that you're saying, okay, this for people whom have been in quote unquote captivity, right? Not dealing with your issues, but rather dealing with the outside issue. And perhaps even perhaps I'm not being unfair if I were to say that some even use the outside issue as an excuse, as we human beings would do anyways, to not deal with other issues, right?
Yeah.
Exactly. So
as a matter of fact, that not to interrupt you, but that's precisely what has happened in the decades since. Our I guess you could call it brain trust, if you will, our intellectuals, thought leaders, and so forth. They have pretty much devoted all of their brain power to the racism question. You know, if you look at, I refer to it as the ebony tower. So you look all these academics and thinkers and intellectuals, and you know, they pretty much every problem that they work on or address is seen through a racial lens. That is to say, were it not for racism, everything would just solve itself. Everything would just go away. You know, we got reparations. We got this is what Ta-Nehisi Coates and others. You know, we just got reparations over. You know, white man just stop hating us. You know, all these problems would just go away. Now, you're a very sharp guy. I know you know that's a bunch of bunk. Humanity is a little bit more complex than that. And the issues that I'm talking about are things that will not be solved. Can they be ameliorated? Yeah. Can they be attenuated to some extent? No doubt. But solved by, you know, the white man just suddenly liking us and treating us real what? No. Because it's what we're dealing with are human nature when we're dealing with human problems in the backdrop of a 21st century post-industrial, some would say postmodern, information age society, where, you know, first world problems are a real thing. So, I mean, you know, part of being free means that you have the right to be frivolous. You're free to be frivolous. You're free to be superficial. You're free to be petty. That's what freedom means. You know, for a lot of black folk, we didn't have that luxury of being petty. We had to deal with the white man, which was a very real concern back through much of the 20th century. You know, so when freedom came along, you know, we had the freedom to be able to, for example, we'll take black women, for example. Black women had the freedom to look beyond whether or not he was a good provider and love the kids. You know, they could choose on other criteria. Well, the problem with that was, one of the problems was that a lot of black women weren't thinking about the fact that a lot of guys could also choose on criteria other than what's good for the race. You know,
okay,
what was good for them.
Okay, 100%. And I'm going to make a quick illustration, and then I'm going to ask this question about the individual. I'm going to get to the individual because one of the things that I think that shines throughout this book is it's an individual perspective, in the sense that even in the subtitle it says for the gentleman, one person, this person,
right.
What's this person to do? A manual for one person, not for the nation or something like that.
Right.
So let me just paint this picture with regards to, again, to buttress this whole point about freedom being a problem, especially, and also to buttress the point that if you are locked up together fighting a boogeyman outside your door, okay, and as a result of that, you and me, Obsidian, and you, Sir Anthony in the chat, and Hybrid Vigor, we all had to fight this boogeyman outside. So we are locked up inside this place and we're organizing our food, clothing, and shelter in a manner such as to fight the boogeyman and to coexist. When the boogeyman leaves, okay, all of a sudden we got to look at each other and be like, hey, you know what? I never liked you, Sir Anthony. Whole way, the way in which you go about doing that whole crap thing, and must you always do that crap you do in the morning? And I don't want to organize it this way. So that is human nature. That's part of the complexity that Obsidian is pointing out to here, which says, hey, if the boogeyman goes away, all our problems will be solved. It's like, no, the boogeyman goes away. Perhaps that'll be the beginning of our problems.
Indeed.
Because now we have to formulate. We have to now play actual politics, which we've not had the time to play because it had not had the time to evolve because we were distracted, right?
That's right. And what I found is that it's very popular to whoop up on the good guy in Black America. And I understand part of the reason why that is. It's part of Black psychology overall. Black people, as a result of the racism experience, and it is legitimate. I'm not saying that it's not. But as a result of it, a byproduct of it is that we're very cynical and suspicious. So anything that's good or presents itself as good, we're automatically suspicious of it because we gotten burned one too many times. So we automatically are very suspicious of it. So the idea that America is a good place and has good values, all of that, we're very suspicious of that, very ambivalent about it. Any product of white institutions, white ideas, white concepts. So for example, like my book is heavily data driven, and I found in talking with a lot of Black folks, they instantly resist any type of data driven analysis. And the argument, and I already know the reason why they're resisting it, because Black folks have been victims of white folks using pseudo analysis, with regard to intelligence, with regard to this, that, and so they fall victim to the fallacy that because this happens, it's kind of like a post hoc ergo propter hoc thing. So because they did this here, it automatically means that's going to be bad over here. And of course, my position is no, that's not true. Just because they did that here does not then mean that all data and analysis is bad. But for a lot of Black people, working through all of these things is a very big challenge. There's a big psychological component at work here, and it's going to take time for us to work through it. And for a lot of Black people, there's a really excellent book. I think I mentioned it I think I mentioned it in my book. There's a really good book by a Black reporter. His name is Eugene Robinson, out of the Washington Post. He's a Pulitzer Prize winner out of Washington Post, and he also was a kind of like a talking head on MSNBC. He wrote a really good book about a decade ago called Disintegration, the Splintering of Black America. And he makes a very interesting argument in the book. He like me, he too looks at the events of the 60s and 70s and observes that Black America is kind of disintegrating into, as he in his schema, 4 distinct Black Americas. So, and he demarcates them. For example, he would look at you, Ike, as part of the emergent, and that is to say Blacks who are either direct immigrants to the United States and or the children of Black immigrants to the United States, largely from Africa and the Caribbean. And he argues in the book that Blacks like you will not only have a different understanding of America, Americana, etc., but also have a completely different take on what it means to be Black than your more traditional, as we would say today, ADOS Black American. And that your uniqueness in that sense will have its say in what it means to be Black. And that will cause some degree of tension between people like yourself and people like myself. That is to say, immigrants, black immigrants to the United States who did not, they didn't come through the slavery experience and Jim Crow experience, and black people like myself who did. So, that's why he calls this disintegration, because there is, in his argument, there is no singular black American community. There are, in fact, at least 4 black communities today, if not more, and they all have their own interests, their own kind of, language, so to speak, their own values, and they can indeed often do conflict with the other black Americas at times. And he argues in the book, the interesting thing that he argues in the book is that one reason why we're so fixated on racism is because that's like really one of the few things we have left that unifies us. Race and racial and racist issues, events, we really blow it out of proportion, the whole Colin Kaepernick thing and all of that. So he says, and matter of fact, black politicians, and for that matter, white politicians, they really don't know how to appeal to black folks outside of a racial rubric. That's really the only thing that we really have that holds us together. Because the successes of the 60s and 70s for black folks, see, this is another thing a lot of black folk don't want to admit, particularly ADOS black folk. I don't think this is as big of an issue for black folk like yourself, but that is to say immigrants. But for ADOS black folk, we're loath to admit that the 60s and 70s worked. Was it perfect? No, it was not perfect. Did everybody benefit equally? No. Are there still problems? Yes. But you can't deny that the needle has moved quite a bit since the mid to late 1960s. The movements worked. The civil rights movement, the women's movement, the anti-war movement, and so on. And the various policy initiatives, Voting Rights Act, Civil Rights Act, Fair Housing Act, etc., etc., etc. They worked. And a lot of black, I'm talking about ADOS black now. A lot of ADOS blacks are loath to admit that. Because see, if you admit that, then you have to answer some other questions. For example, if you admit that those things worked, then you have to ask, why is the black family falling apart then? Why is it a shadow of its former self? Even though racism has greatly receded. Why is that? You can't blame that on racism. How? I mean, how do you make that argument with a straight face? There has to be something else that accounts for it. My argument is that freedom happened. And Robinson argues in his book kind of sort of the same thing. And the challenge in the 21st century, or one of the challenges in the 21st century, is that you're going to have a very interesting, particularly as your group, because they're actually 2 subsets of the emergent, as Robinson points out in his book. You're the first subset. That is to say, direct immigrants from Africa or the Caribbean, or their children. So in other words, second generation, right? But then there's another group of emergents, and those are the children of interracial unions, biracial people. So I just mentioned Colin Kaepernick, for example. There have been a number. Patrick Mahomes would be another one. Griffin, I think his name is, basketball player. So in other words, you're going to see more and more prominent biracial black Americans. And Barack Obama, they're going to give their unique take on what it means to be black, which can and often does conflict with the more traditional ADOS black American. And that's what Robinson is talking about, that these conflicts, which are not pretty, they're not politically correct, they're not something that we like to discuss. Another major fault line is class, social class. Like he has one group that he talks about that are known as the transcendent. And the transcendent are basically your very successful Black Americans. They're not only wealthy, that's part of it. But another part of being a transcendent Black is that you have a very high public profile. Okay, so wealth is part of it, but you're also famous. And that has its own kind of wealth. Just being famous, being on what I refer to as the Jumbotron, social media. Being famous in itself, as reality TV shows us, just being famous in itself has its own kind of currency. So you have the wealth component, and you also have this fame component. And you know, that's a very powerful, heady mix. And the transcendent kind of have, you know, transcended, as their name befits, they kind of transcended, you know, more mundane Black concerns. You know, Oprah Winfrey, Bill Cosby before his fall, and, you know, subsequent, you know, vindication. Michael Jordan, that sort of thing.
Let me stop you there for a second, because you've traversed the land quite thoroughly, showing economic differences and also class-like differences, and then previously you're mentioning cultural differences. And let me mention something there with regards to the immigrant, and then we'll continue, if you will, back to the select F-boy.
Yeah.
But with regards to the immigrant, basically an immigrant, especially anyone, whether it be from Bengali or Nigeria, coming from the East, okay, from the emerging world to the West, if you will, right? They're here for meeting particular needs which have to do with, shall I say, the lower end of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. What I mean is they're coming for economic questions, okay? They're coming for food, clothing, shelter, the establishment of a domicile over here, and also perhaps helping people outside, okay? Right. There is a whole term. Can I get a 1 in the chat if we've all heard of the immigrant mentality, right? And it's not specific to, Caribbean immigrant, African immigrant, Russian immigrant. There's something called the immigrant mentality, which means basically, hey, this person left somewhere to come over here where there's an opportunity, and they're after opportunity. They're after money. They're after economics, what we call the lower end of Maslow's hierarchy of needs again, right?
Right.
That gives you a very different view of the situation, okay? So the higher end of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, which is what the natives tend to concern themselves with after having fed and clothed themselves, right? Then you're worried about things such as self-esteem and representation and self-actualization and what it means to be a Black person in America, right?
Right.
The immigrant is like, what are you talking about? I'm like the fox that got let into the hen house, and I'm here to tear things up, okay? I'm here to tear as many chickens as possible, gather up my chicken situation, send chickens to Africa. That's the idea. Hence, generally speaking, you're going to see a rift between, shall we say, native populations and immigrant populations when it comes to political ends, right? Because the political ends are very different, because also the immigrant might not even have the right to vote. He might be partially illegal, right? And so on and so forth, in addition to the fact that that's not what he's here for. So generally speaking, we've always had immigrants, and the native populations, shall we say, versus the new immigrant Mexicans versus the Mexican Americans.
Right.
The Chinese, they call them the ABCs, American-born Chinese, versus the FOBs, the fresh off the boat Chinese, right?
Right.
And these people tend to also be the ones that contend most closely with each other, right?
Right.
In terms of, you're going to be fighting your family member, as it tends to be, right?
Right.
Because, and also they have a struggle for identity with each other, right? Which is almost like an ego struggle, okay? So basically, it's just kind of taking some simple psychology and then broadening it into the groups and so on and so forth. So I think that everything that you say there is 100% correct. And then with regards to trajectories now, because I believe you're quoting that as a way of somebody making a prediction, saying that, hey, in the future, what the collective Black experience was before will get, shall we say, diluted, right? Yeah. And this dilution, right, will result in something new. So generally, an outline and a broad sketch wise, I see no issues with such an argument or a thesis, if you will, right? What would it be to have high quality? Because in the self-help, shall we, world, there's also that issue, right, where you can have a lot of BS, right? And then you can have maybe some good stuff. Now, and those whom are connoisseurs have the way of judging, right? So what would you say are some what are the best practices? What are bad practices? I think that you do have judgments as to how some people within the industry, right, the black love industry, whatever, operate and handle themselves, right? So whether you call it a code of ethics or whether you call it producing a high quality product, because for example, your advice in this book about whether it be the save yourself aspect, your 10 commandments, if you will, is a kind of an admonishment, right? So what exactly makes yours, and I'm not asking this in that kind of a way, right? But you get what I'm saying. What are the values that infuse your views such that you can say this is of a high quality, and I'm putting this out there as a manifesto, if you will?
Well, I mean, the number one thing that separates me from the rest of the pack is that my work is data driven. So I'm not telling you what I think or my life experience. I don't think my life experience is particularly all that interesting now, as it turns out. Quite a few people are interested in what I do in my life. And it kind of takes me aback because I don't think my life is that interesting. What sets me apart from everybody else is not my life's experiences or, my witticisms or what I think, but rather the research that I've done and that I present on the science of human mating within the context of a 21st century Black American mating market experience.
100%.
My colleagues, excuse me.
No, I said 100%, and because I started out with my introduction saying that this is a very well researched book, right? And the points that are being made are actually not. Let me put it this way, and I'm sorry for cutting you off, but I just wanted you to kind of. So, what is? I would say that this book, okay, is the taking of, shall we say, the mating and dating industry, right? Not the industry, right? The state of mating and dating, marriages, the family structure within a particular community, taking that as a lens, okay, or as a focal point to really talk about male stoicism and individuality. Now, what do I mean by that? I mean, like in your 10 commandments, for example, a through line that goes through them for me is the world doesn't owe you stuff, okay? Neither are you obligated in a particular way, right? And that things are unfair. There is a rule for the select and there's a rule for the non-select. All this so far is stoicism stuff. There are things I can't control, things I cannot control. Give me the strength to withstand those that I cannot, right? And so on and so forth, and the wisdom to know the difference, right? The serenity prayer, the stoicism, and then the individualism, which is saying you play your part, right? You be the gentleman with the hobbies, as you say, rule number 10, right? So I think that it is really a distillation. When I distill it, I find in there stoic individualism, right? Those are the two words, and then all these other things are kind of wrapped in there. So if we go to some of the super chats, which I've been missing, okay, and I think there's some questions in there too.
I wanted to jump in on that point before you go to the super chats. If I
go
may.
ahead.
Because the last time around we had to talk about this, I touched on it then and bringing it back now. I didn't think about, Marcus Aurelius or the Stoics, and all that when I wrote this. But I'm glad you brought it up because the last time we talked, I had said that my birthright, a major part of it, aside from being an American and a very proud one, I'm a patriot, is that a big part of my birthright is the Enlightenment, is Jerusalem and Athens, is the scientific method, is the Western tradition. That's part of my birthright. I think Black Americans in general are really selling themselves short and doing themselves a huge disservice by remaining ambivalent at best and hostile at worst to their own birthright, not just as American citizens, but as the recipients and inheritors of a rich cultural heritage that we help to contribute to, I might add, which is the Western tradition. And so it's interesting that you will point out that you see a through line in my 10 Obsidian commandments toward the end of the book, where I kind of put my stake in the ground of exactly where I stand on things. It's interesting that you, as in many ways, an outsider, have this kind of ability to see in what I'm writing the Stoics. But that's part of the Western tradition. And in many ways, I was raised as a Stoic. You know, I'm an amalgamation of many things. I'm part Islam, I'm part Christianity, I'm part Judeo-Christian, I'm part American, I'm part African, I'm part, Jerusalem, I'm part Athens, I'm part Shakespeare, I'm part Locke, I'm all of it. That's what it means to be a citizen of the West. That's what it means to be an American. And I think Black people are really selling themselves short by being ambivalent to that at best and hostile to that at worst.
Okay. Let me go ahead and check out these super chats, and there's some questions in there that bear upon many of these topics here. So it's quite interesting because one of the topics that, and perhaps another conversation or whatever, or I don't know what you're working on next, but there's this idea of what exactly is the position of the African American with regards to American patriotism, right?
Yeah.
American patriotism and African Americans. What exactly does that look like? You said contribution also, like, you've contributed to the history of the most powerful country in the world. Right. So where is the pride in that? Why don't you take full pride, full ownership, you saying it's your birthright and things like that? And it seems like you're quite passionate about it, but let me grab the super chats and we'll continue. Indeed. So there's another question here. Shout out to K Polymath. And I like this because it's something that is tangentially addressed in your book in a certain way. And even in this conversation so far, you have mentioned the phrase postmodern, right? So basically, I see K Polymath here throwing a postmodern jab, saying, hey, Mr. Obsidian, why do you think that this notion, which after all came out of a particular cocoon and development called, freedom, rights, and so on and so forth, which, by the way, we know also is I don't want to get into deep political philosophy, but it is a myth of its own, right? It's not like it wasn't handed down to us from God, like something,
right.
like that. Like if Genghis Khan came back right now and decided to change the whole system, he'll change it, right? And your rights be damned. So the idea is, okay, can we operate in that mode? And here's what the challenge I would say is this. In other words, it's kind of old to try to operate in that mode because right now people are, in particular case, if your enemy is a conglomeration in the left, let's just say generally speaking, right? Not that this is the Rush Limbaugh show or something, but if they're over there on the left, they're in academia, they're in the media, right? They're in the New York Times, so on and so forth. And then, have these, as they like to say over here, talking points that are in the feminism end and things like that. Those people tend to play very much power games in the sense of they are not consistent with their arguments. It's about power play. There's a lot of sign language, let's put it that way, right? Shames, insult, guilt need to be not. It's isms and phobes. Oh, you're a xenophobe, sexist, bigoted, right? That tends to be the game. And it doesn't matter because might is right. If they can smother you and so on and so forth, all this talk about the true, the good, and the beautiful, rights and justice and individualism, that's of the past, okay? Now is time for realpolitik, postmodern sword fighting. And is the Black man up to that? I would modify the question to say such. And go ahead and speak on that whole flurry of words there.
Yeah, I think that the historical record speaks for itself. I grew up in I was born and raised here in Philly, and I grew up in a section of Philadelphia known as Germantown. Germantown is a technical suburb of Philadelphia, and it was founded before the founding of the United States itself. It was founded in circa 1638 or something like that. And a big part of the American Revolutionary War was fought like only a few blocks away from where I grew up. And the first Black soldiers who fought in the Revolutionary War fought only a few blocks away from where I grew up. The Battle of Germantown. You can look this up. It was October 1777, if I remember right. And so I say all that to say that Black men have earned their stripes through every war this country has ever had. We've earned our stripes. So this idea of white supremacy and all that's a bunch of bunk. Black men can do anything white men can do. We are limited only by our will to do it. But we want to do it, we can do it. And we've earned our stripes here.
Gotcha. Now, there's another shout out to African Millennial. Thank you very much. I believe those are Canadian dollars. And check out her channel by that name, African Millennial. She is a African Canadian sister out there, originally from Ghana. And nice, sweet lady. Maybe one of you guys can prove her wrong here regarding getting married in the Americas, and you guys can go wife her up. For those of you looking for continentals. So she just made a comment that it doesn't seem to be worth it to get married here. Let me ask you something. Let me ask the same question I just asked. K Polymath put it a certain way. I modified it a certain way. You strong armed us by saying, "No, we can do it." Okay. Now let me ask this: the stoicism, the individual stoicism, okay, that you say you're raised with and that your book professes. What is the percentage of men that can live that life? And let's put the theory aside, because you know that life from a, shall we say, visceral first-person perspective, right? You've gone through things in your life that you had to deal with and overcome. You have a family background, I presume, of such that raised you in that way. And what do you know about the percentages of people that are actually able to actualize the stoic individualism that you profess?
I think a lot of brothers, this is an interesting question because the older I get, it was pointed out to me on several occasions, and we all suffer from it. It's a human failing. I kind of had my own kind of fishbowl effect, kind of my own myopia, that I assumed that a whole lot of black men were like me in terms of upbringing, outlook, and so forth. And the longer I did the Black Manosphere thing, it became very clear and apparent to me that that was not necessarily true. And so to answer your question, how many black men can kind of live a kind of stoic life a la Obsidian? That's an interesting question. That's a very interesting question. I don't know.
Good. I like it. I like it because when it was placed theoretically, I think because theoretically some black, but when it comes down to percentages, it has to, because here's what I'm thinking, and I may be rambling here. There are privileges. Some particular positions, some moral positions are privileged positions. I'm not being all postmodernist about, you're speaking from a position of privilege. What I mean is, it's almost like you were able to get on a particular hill. Some people don't even have feet, right?
Yeah, you're right. The whole privilege thing is part of the woke lexicon these days. And in a very real sense, I was privileged. I mean, watching Kevin Samuel's work over the past, not just over the past year and a half, but I've known him now for the better part of 5 years. So watching him over that arc of time, what became very apparent to me is just how many black men didn't have what I have. And that is to say, a very active and involved and hands-on at times. I would have not preferred him to be so hands-on, hint, father, and very involved grandfather, both combat veterans, both Marines. And if anybody knows, if you know anything about the United States Marine Corps, they have a bit of a different way of looking at things than the other branches of the armed services do. They have a completely different mentality. And it's difficult for it not to rub off on you if you grow up in their household.
This is a black pill moment that we've been having for the past 5 minutes, right? It's more of like, okay, well, you realize that you're able, as a result of having these particular people in your background who climbed hills themselves and then showed you the example and were able to elevate you up. And from that hill, the perspective says individual stoicism. But if people can't get to that hill, they perhaps can't even see what you're saying, number one. And I'm sure you've experienced that. People come and argue and scream at you in various chats or something like that. And number two, be able to implement it is another thing. So there's always the idea, and this may not be of your interest at all. You may be like, I'm about the individual and also the individual that is like me, that can enact this particular path. But
Right.
prescriptions for the general population, because you talk about the gentleman, there's a particular aesthetic to it. And also there's this, as I said, there's the ethos of stoicism and individualism. There's also an aesthetic. Before we go to your prescriptions for the general population, what is this aesthetic of the gentleman? Is it just one that you prefer? I know about the rakish, roguish, and refined, and you're sticking with the refined archetype, if you will. Is this something that you promote? Does this help in any way? Or is it just your particular preference? In other words, is the gentlemanliness or being a gentleman, is it a standard that you would equally say, hey, I'm putting it out there, along with individualism and stoicism, also be a gentleman? Or what? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, the whole thing about the book of Obsidian was modeled on myself. So that's the conceit about the book. It's very much modeled on me. And so the other, rakish and so forth, those are the other archetypes per Kevin's schema would be something that, while I'm familiar with them, they're not something that I have an intimacy with in the way I do with a refined thing. It's funny, we was talking one day, this is like 2 years ago. We're talking one day, and I asked him, because I heard him talk about these different archetypes in his schema, and I said, I'm just curious, Kevin, what do you think I fall in the schema? Without skipping the beat, he said refined. He said, what a lot of people don't, in this case, men, don't realize is that it's more than just putting on some clothes. They have to speak to who you are inside. The clothes are just the finishing touches. That's the magic. If there's in the pickup world, there's a concept being called being incongruent. So, you're doing one thing and saying something else, for example. So if you're a person that's naturally rakish or roguish and you try to be refined in look and manner, it's going to come off to other people as, incongruent. Mm-hmm. And he was saying that though you did not come from what we would commonly associate with a refined, gentlemanly background. You didn't go to Eton. You didn't go to Exeter. You weren't born upper middle class, but you have those inherent traits and qualities and characteristics. And so when you do clean up, it makes sense. People, just kind of take it as a given that, yeah, he's always been like that, which is true.
So I believe K Polymath has another super chat right here for us. Shout out to you, sir. One can't judge the select F boy unless, and that's a £5, by the way, about $7, unless you've been given that much freedom and power. Back to the thing that we said before, opportunity and so on, right? And morality is only real under position of power. Good. It's the kind of thing as, being good is what you do when no one is looking. In other words, because when no one is looking is when you have the freedom and the power. And if you're over here without freedom or power, talking about people whom are using their freedom or power, but this gets us into a particular, shall we say, it's a quandary. And perhaps this is, I don't know if, let me ask you now, are you working on a follow-up to this or perhaps a distillation of it? Because again, I think that, again, it is a work of philosophy, but using the dating landscape as something there. And that this work of philosophy then comes up against a particular thing which says, hey, isn't it all really about power, right? In other words, the postmodernist question always one has to contend with when one does. Anyways, are you following up and working on anything new? And with regards to this postmodernist stuff,
Yeah, I'm working, well, as it stands right now, I'm working on a kind of book of Obsidian for the lovely ladies. I'm going to take a stab. This time I want to take a, direct stab right into the heart of the Black love industry. I'm kind of was on the periphery the last time around because the black dating coaching for Black men business is still very new. So that's still kind of on the periphery of the Black love machine. But my next book is going to go right to the heart of it. That is to say, going to be addressing Black women this time around. And so it's a really interesting project that I have been, fiddling around with now for about a year and a half, since spring of 2020. So I've been fiddling around with it, and I have plans to, finally finish it up. And if everything goes right, inshallah, I'll be out in time for Valentine's Day weekend 2022. So we'll see, keep our fingers crossed. But and I also have plans to swing back around and finish out the triptych or the trilogy of the Book of Obsidian. I had envisioned it as a triptych. So so there's book 1, is volume 1 that's out right now, and I hope to have volume 2 out later in 2022, and then in 2023 I hope to have volume 3 out. So but some 1,500 pages and all. So yeah,
indeed. So yes, to reiterate the F-boy concept, especially the select F-boy, because the select male is that guy. And if you, it's the kind of thing where, okay, if you want to know whether you're select or not, if you have to ask, you're probably not select. Ain't that right, Obsidian?
Yeah,
if you gotta,
great thing about Black women, unlike women of other races and ethnic groups and stuff like that, the great thing about Black women is they're so florid and direct to a fault. And so, yeah, that sounds about right. If you have to ask what it is, chances are you ain't it. Because Black women are very, very vocal about what they want in men and what they don't want in men. So the good news being Black is that right off the rip what Black women want and what they don't want. So that's a good thing.
That's the select guy. And then the select F-boy is the guy that, because of that position of freedom, power, and privilege, can get away with a lot, and does indeed get away with a lot, and conspires with the women, right? Because they're the ones, they want that guy, right? So they go after him, and they both conspire to F things up. And then people have to clean up. So the non-select guy tends to then be the cleanup guy. Goes the narrative.
I liken it to a roadside bomb. Right, or improvised explosive device. See, right now, then we talking about this, the postmodern thing kind of hangs in the background here. Excuse me. So the argument that's going on, particularly in white intellectual and academic circles, and to some extent political circles, excuse me, is, are there gender differences? Are men and women truly different? That does play a role to some extent over on the Black side. And so what a lot of Black women are having a hard time coming to grips with is that mating for them carries significant implications far beyond themselves. So if they mate well, it can have positive implications, not just for themselves, but for their children, and by extension, their neighborhood, their community. On the other hand, if they mate badly, it will have serious negative implications for their children, and by extension for the entire community. So I liken it to while I was sick, in my convalescence, I spent a lot of time watching war documentaries, right? Afghanistan and Iraq, in that order. And hands down, the most dangerous weapon used against United States NATO coalition forces was the roadside bomb, the improvised explosive device. Did a lot of horrendous damage, not just to the military forces, but also civilians as well. And some of these devices, I mean, they could have a serious, I mean, they could blow a huge crater in the ground, and so I liken the situation with Black women, this mating piece with these select F-boys, and the damage that they can do. I liken it to rolling up on a powerful, big roadside bomb. So you got this huge blast radius. So not only is the Black woman involved herself, now you got her children involved, and then it extends out, the blast radius extends out to include the community. So now you're looking at collateral damage of other people being affected, right? Windows getting blown out, people catching shrapnel and shards of glass, etc., etc., etc. That's the image I like to use, is the blast radius idea. Black women, well, women in general, in this case, black women, mating is never casual for them because eggs expensive, sperm cheap.
Mm-hmm.
So mating for women is never casual.
Mm-hmm.
It may look that way.
Mm-hmm.
They may believe it is,
Mm-hmm.
but mating for them is never casual. It always has a heavy price potentially for it.
Indeed. So let me ask this, because so far we're talking about an industry, right? The black love industry, selling some particular kind of propaganda, shall we say, propagating the F-boy story and leading to the Derek Jackson effect, as you called it. There's another thing that, another, shall we say, set of people, and you call it the pro-black community, right?
Yeah.
And what are they into? Okay, so from your, I'll give you just distill down 3 points. You could comment on them. The pandering, basically, which, you know, black woman is God type stuff, right? We were kings and queens type stuff, right? And the blame of slavery and Jim Crow type stuff, which basically is a good way, a good tool when you're stuck, okay, in that building. Remember, you're stuck in and you're fighting the big bad Jim Crow outside. There's certain tools that make sense to use, right? Certain crutches to have. And those crutches, after you're set free, when you come out of the house and you're still holding that crutch and you're still, you know, eating with a screwdriver, people are like, hey, you're no longer in a dungeon anymore. You don't have to keep referring to yourself as a king or a queen. As a matter of fact, you're not a king, right? The king of where? In other words, accountability, reality. Shut the hell up. Ain't no debt. You're not a queen of nothing. Okay? There's accountability and reality, and the shit that needs to be done in the real world vis-a-vis real consequences. Yeah. And if you have not earned something, it's great, yeah, that you have to use it as a psychological tool to cross a particular river. But as the Buddhists say, after you cross the river, don't carry the canoe and put it on your head and walk with the canoe. Do you do that? No. You leave the canoe back there.
Right.